Good afternoon. So it says in the program I'm here from TransLink, and that's technically true. I work for TransLink. I get my paycheck from TransLink. But for the last year, I've been employed, in fact, by this thing called the Mobility Pricing Independent Commission. So the things I'm telling you in this presentation, they're the policy, they're the findings of this commission. They're not necessarily the findings or the opinions of TransLink. I'm not just saying that because my CEO is in the corner. So Kevin did a great job of giving you some of the context to the challenge that we're facing in Metro Vancouver, or the great opportunity, depending on how you look at it. Of course, population growth is a great potential and possibility for the region. But the region is growing. We're expecting a million new people, 500,000 new jobs at least by 2040. It's leading to great things. It's creating new density, new mixed-use neighbourhoods, all of the fantastic transit that Kevin was talking about, and more that the region would like to build. But despite all of this, doing everything right, building the city in the right way, building the transit that we need to do it, the congestion is growing rapidly. And the Commission's work found that traffic congestion in the region could be up by around 40% by 2030. You could maybe ask, well, why is this happening when we're spending so much money on transit, when we're spending so much money on greater density, on building the city in the correct way? What I would say is if we weren't doing all of those things, this congestion would be rising much more rapidly. It would be a much greater challenge that we're facing. There's some inequity and inconsistency in the way we're paying for mobility, and some of the background to that was when this commission was initiated, there were toll bridges. Two of the bridges across the Fraser River, if you're familiar with the region, had tolls on them. The others didn't. Some new bridges were being built or replaced, and there were plans for tolls on those. And there was an idea that we're gradually putting together this patchwork of payment for road facilities without really a common strategy for it. The provincial government solved that problem when they came in just over a year ago and decided to abolish these tolls, which gave us a great natural experiment to see what tolls do. It take away the tolls, you introduce or increase congestion. No surprise to me, but some surprise to some other people. And of course, we've got big demands for increasing investment in infrastructure, and not least the operational costs that we just heard about. But the background to this also is what's happening with the fuel tax. Fuel tax is quite an important source of revenue for most of us, for our operations, I'm sure. Actually, fuel tax is becoming an increasingly unstable revenue source. It's always been fluctuating with the economy, with what's happening with oil prices. What we're seeing now is with increasing fuel efficiency and not least the introduction of electric cars, the long-term trend for fuel tax revenues is downwards. And a lot of our neighbours to the south are seeing this and are scrambling quickly to replace fuel tax with a distance-based charge for all their road use. So I'm not going to introduce you to every one of the 14 people who were on our commission. The important thing to say here is it was a citizen commission put together, appointed by the Mayor's Council, the 26 municipalities of the Lower Mainland, together with the board of TransLink, came together and established this commission to look at mobility pricing. It was not a new idea. Mobility pricing has been in regional planning documents since the early 90s, but this was kind of the first big effort to say, it was part of the Mayor's plan, to say we really need to grab this, take it a little bit out of its context of everything else, look at how we might study it, and then put it back into the regional planning, transportation planning system. So this commission was set up to do this extraordinary piece of work, slightly at arm's length from politics, because this is a very politically difficult question. Do the best research you can, go out and do some engagement with the public, get this conversation going, try to understand what the questions are that we need to be dealing with, and then bring it back to us. So an independent commission, a citizen commission, they're not stakeholder representatives. They do represent labour and employment organisations. They come from the academic sector, they're former politicians, they come from the charitable sector, but they're not here representing their organisations, they are here representing us citizens of Metro Vancouver. Nor are they experts necessarily in transportation. There are some people here with lots of fantastic transportation background, but they were not brought in to be transportation experts. The Commission was established or began its work rather in the spring of 2017 and reported back to the Mayor's Council and to TransLink in spring of 2018. So it was quite a concentrated period of, as I say, both research and engagement on two twin tracks. If you want to talk to me later about the wisdom of doing research and engagement on that research all at the same time, then we can do that. The Commission had quite a clear mandate set out by the Mayor's Council and by the board of TransLink, and this is kind of the condensed version of the 15 pages that I spent the rest of the last year of my life living based on. They were to evaluate and make recommendations on how to develop and implement a regional road usage charging policy and system. So it wasn't, they were not asked if this should be done, they were asked how would you do this? If we want to do this, how should we do it? The question was never if should we do it, it's how do we do it? And to assess implications for the pricing of other types of transport and mobility. And this is kind of what we mean by mobility pricing. One element of mobility pricing is how we charge to use the roads. Another element is how we are charging to use our transit system. A further element is how should we charge TNCs, how should we charge for bike share. Mobility pricing is kind of this umbrella term, how do we pay to get around? Road usage charging is one kind of missing piece from most of our communities. The Commission was given three objectives. They were to look at how to manage congestion. I think Kevin again was very clear that this fits within the managing demand for the limited capacity. It's not necessarily a revenue-raising tool in itself, or that's not the primary purpose. What we said within the Commission was we should look at reducing congestion, do that in a way that is fair, and that could raise some revenue. Revenue was never the primary objective here, and I would argue, and I think the Commission would argue, and argues quite clearly in its report, that you should not have revenue raising as your primary target. There needs to be other things that you're trying to achieve. Metro Vancouver is not the first region to look at this. I know Toronto had an experiment that perhaps we shouldn't talk too much about because it wasn't massively successful. But some other experience that maybe was more successful. London, where I began my career working on congestion pricing in the early 2000s, has had congestion charging since 2003. It's very effective at reducing congestion. If you ask people in London today, has it reduced congestion, they will say no, absolutely not. If you look at the figures, you will see yes. Congestion today in central London is still better than it was before 2003 when the charge was introduced. Its impact has reduced somewhat, but that's partly because the population of London has increased exponentially since that time, not exponentially, quickly. So London is today raising about $300 million net per year. It is spending that money primarily on operating and improving the bus network. The mayor in London was very clear that we're taking money from people. People need to see the impacts of that really, really quickly. There needs to be something very tangible on the road almost immediately. And we did put in a lot of new extra bus service, and those buses had on the side of them, this is paid for by congestion charge revenues, and I think that was a really important part of the message in London. Actually, one of the big pieces of work we had to do in London as soon as the charge was introduced was rewrite all of the bus timetables, because all the buses started coming to their stops far too early. And I'm sure a room full of transit people know the worst thing you can do as a bus driver is leave your bus stop too early. So we had to change all of the bus timetables in order to make sure that we were making the absolute most benefit out of this congestion charge. That, of course, reduced operating costs, which is not insignificant. At the same time, we're increasing the number of passengers, so fare revenue is increasing. So there's kind of an interesting virtuous circle here for public transport, or road-based public transport in particular. Stockholm in Sweden, where I spent the last 10 years of my career working on congestion pricing, amongst other things, introduced pricing in 2006. Again, if you look at the data, if you ask people in Stockholm, is congestion better now than it was before congestion charging? No, it's just as bad as it was. But if you look at the figures, you can see that's quite clearly not true, and that congestion today, road traffic entering central Stockholm is way lower than it was before charging was introduced in 2006. And again, that's with a background of a very rapid population growth. Stockholm is not spending its money on very immediate, tangible improvements. Stockholm is using this money to contribute to 25% of about a $17 billion investment that's going on in metro lines, in new roads, in massive new infrastructure projects. And there's a bit of a problem with that, because that means we're not seeing the benefit of that money until 5, 10, 15, 20 years after we've started charging. It also means Stockholm is committed to carrying on charging until 2050 at least, in order to pay back the massive loans that it's taken out in order to build this infrastructure. Just in case you're from a small community and thinking this has nothing to do with me, it's just a big city thing, I thought I'd bring this example of Namsos, Norway, a small town of about 8,000 people clinging to the side of a field. They have had a road usage charging system also since the mid-2000s. It's giving them very modest, but for a community of 8,000 people, actually quite a lot of revenue, about $2 million a year, that is being spent on, in particular, a new bridge, but also cycle paths, walking paths, things to just make the city environment much nicer. So the final report that was handed over to the Mayor's Council and TransLink in May, it contains a number of things. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail of it because it's very Vancouver specific, and I'm trying to keep this general. But it gives some policy principles for mobility pricing. If you want to introduce mobility pricing, you should probably be ticking off these principles. And they're things like, you need to have enough congestion in order to make it worth it. You should not be doing this only to raise revenues, but you can raise a lot of revenue. The revenue you should be using in this way. If you want to make sure it's fair and equitable, you need to be thinking about these things. It's got quite a lot of detail and some quite concrete recommendations. It includes some illustrative examples of road usage charging, what that could look like in the region. It's not a suggestion, it's not a proposal, these are not fully baked ideas by any stretch of the imagination. It's a first example of, this is what it could look like, this is how it could work, these are the kinds of impacts that would have, this is what it might cost people. And it gives some clear next steps. If you wish to proceed, these are the steps you would need to go through. This is more or less how long it would take. This is how much it might cost you to implement, that kind of thing. The full report's about 350 pages, but there's a summary for those who don't want to get into that kind of detail, is available at this website, mobilitypricing.ca. So the Commission has 3 key conclusions. It says, as Kevin alluded to earlier, you could reduce congestion, regional congestion across the region by around 20 to 25% and increase reliability by around 20%. These are lovely numbers that make the heart of a transportation planner sing, but maybe don't mean much to the public. So what we tried to compare it to was, imagine what the traffic is like during the school holidays. That's about the kind of difference you would see, actually probably a little bit more than that, but you don't need to reduce the traffic an enormous amount to have a very big impact on congestion. There are ways to make it fair for all users, but that is very dependent on what you're using the revenues for, and I'll come back to that. And you can raise very significant revenues for transportation, and possibly in a way that is slightly more transparent than what our chair, Alan Seckel, called nickel and dime taxes that we are using to fund our transportation system now. There's a lot of revenues coming into the transportation system through lots of different taxes that we maybe don't entirely see, we don't entirely have a full grasp as members of the public how much money is going to the transportation system from various taxes. So we presented these 2 pricing concepts. One is a point charge, so you would charge people to cross 12 of the major bridges in the region. The other is a distance charge. You charge different amounts by the distance you travel, depending on the time of day and where you are in the region. I don't want to go into a huge amount of detail of that, but we came up with a daily household cost for households of around $5 to $8 per day on the bridge charges, around $3 to $5 on the distance charges. These are not inconsiderable numbers, and I'll come back to that in a second. They could achieve the same level, more or less, of congestion reduction. That was the thing we normalised on, and could raise annual revenues in the field of $1 to $1.5 billion a year. That's net. That is after the costs have been taken out. So quite considerable amounts of money we could raise, probably way more than we're going to need realistically to invest in the transportation system. I'm sure we could all think of things that we could spend that money on. So people were very concerned about the cost, and I think that's not unreasonable, and in a region like I'm sure many of yours are, in the midst of what could be described as an affordability crisis. But we need to come and think about this quite important paradox that our chair, Alan Seckel, came up with. That's why we've called it Seckel's paradox. The less you charge, the more it's just a tax grab. So we want to reduce congestion. There's no point doing this unless you're trying to reduce congestion. That's where the big benefit comes. It's actually quite an expensive way to raise revenues. I'll come back to that. But we want to reduce congestion. If you want to reduce congestion, you need to set the charge at a level that is going to achieve that congestion reduction. That will probably be at a level that people will perceive as being too high. We're trying to get people to change their behaviour. We need a price signal that's going to be reasonably high. You could charge less if you want to, but then you're not going to have any benefits because you won't be reducing congestion. I could have explained that better, I'm sorry, but read the report. It's a complicated paradox, but it's really important. The important part of that is you have then raised enough money that you can address the inequity that you may have created. And equity is absolutely key to the acceptance of this. People are very concerned about it from a fairness perspective. And we mean very different things when we talk about fairness. Equity is one element of fairness that we're trying to understand a lot more about. And how you use the revenues is really the key to equity. So the question we need to ask ourselves is not, is mobility pricing fair? It's, is mobility pricing more or less equitable in the way we are currently funding things? And I would suggest that the answer to that is we simply don't know, because we actually don't know enough about how equitable the current funding mechanisms are. We have a kind of status quo bias. We assume that the way we are charging for things today, the way we are taxing for things today, is the best way to do it, and any change to that is going to be worse. Actually, that might not be true. And we need to do the sums to find out whether that's true or not. And that's what we're spending a lot of our time on right now. I will hop over that one. Partly because of the equity question, but partly because of other questions, particularly around access to transit alternatives, people thinking or telling us that they are priced out of the market in Vancouver and having to move further and further away in order to find affordable housing, which is partly true and also partly more complex than that. It's not a massively popular thing to want to do. We're coming and changing the status quo. We're going to say we're going to charge you for something that you already pay for in some way. Actually, we're saying we're going to change the way you're going to pay for it, and it's going to give you congestion benefits. People don't generally believe it will reduce congestion. Everybody thinks that they have to be on the road at this time, and therefore everybody else has to. But we did a lot of survey work, both before the Commission started its work and after the Commission reported out. This survey is not actually carried out by the Commission. This was carried out by the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade. It came out about 2-3 weeks ago. A big survey around attitudes in advance of the municipal elections. They asked particularly here, should local governments work with provincial government to pursue mobility pricing? You'll see politicians at the bottom there who's obviously got a lot more information, got a lot more insight into the challenge that the region is facing, and think, yes, we should work with them. They're not saying we should implement it, they're saying we should work with them. The business community have been very favourable throughout this process. But I think a 42-43 split for the public is actually quite a fantastic result to have at this stage. When I was working on this project in London before it was implemented, it was nothing like this equal. We had maybe 30% in favour, 70-something% against. The same in Stockholm, it was maybe 30% in favour, 70% against. What's happened typically in cities that have implemented this is there's a lot of opposition to begin with. The closer you get to implementation, the greater that opposition increases because people are very worried it won't work, you'll just move congestion around, transit won't cope, the sky will fall on our heads. Then when it's implemented and people see the results, they see the congestion is reduced, they see that the negative impacts are not nearly as bad as they thought it was going to be. You see these approval ratings increased. Stockholm actually had a referendum after introducing congestion charging saying, should we keep it, should we make it permanent? And more than 50% of people in the city voted, yes, we'd like to make it permanent. There was a municipal election in Stockholm less than a month ago. Congestion charging wasn't even an issue, nobody raised it. Some people suggested increasing it because we needed more money, or increasing it because we needed less congestion. Nobody suggested removing it. So what we're working on right now is research on equity and affordability. We are in TransLink working to confirm or otherwise the role of mobility pricing in the new transportation strategy. How much should we describe it? What information is needed in order for decision makers to feel confident that they still want mobility pricing in the regional transportation strategy. And if a decision were made to proceed, and that's a big if at the moment, it would take at least 3 to 5 years to implement. So this is not something happening anytime soon. This is not something if you're looking for money tomorrow to do. It's a long-term investment, and it's something that needs to be done for other reasons. And that's kind of my main conclusion. Yes, you can raise a lot of money, but it's actually quite an expensive way to raise money. We talked a lot about making this, how could you make this revenue neutral? And of course you can make it revenue neutral, you can't make it cost neutral for the public because it will cost somewhere between 10 to 25% of your revenues are going to go in operating expenses. You need very clear objectives. Congestion is going to be the primary one that you can get economic benefits from, but it could be air quality, it could be safety, it could be CO2 emissions. How you use those revenues will be absolutely key to determining equity. So we need to think about, can we return these revenues in tax refunds? Can we return these revenues? Can we reduce transit fares? Can we build particular kinds of transit to move the equity needle in the way we heard about in the previous session? All things that we need to be studying now and work out what's the best way to do it. It will be controversial, and my little own hobby horse, this is not a fix for poor land use decisions. We do need to keep building cities in the way that that will reduce the need to travel, that will reduce, that contribute to reducing congestion, and we need to keep investing in transit. It's one of the tools in the toolbox. We need to be using all the tools together. The full report, as I say, is available at mobilitypricing.ca. Thank you.